Welcome to everybody. I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, and I am going to ask people to be on mute because we have a large number of people who are joining us, and background noise can be very distracting and also embarrassing to the person whose dog or children or husband finds themselves in the middle of a Zoom call. So please check your Zoom corner where there's the microphone that says mute. And if it doesn't have the red line across it, please do mute yourself. So again, thanks for joining us. When we decided to hold this town hall tonight, before the first of the year, we had planned, and we will be talking about election reform for New York State. Because there is a full agenda and more to be done, even though we've had some really significant improvements. But as we learned in November, we still need further reforms and adjustments. But we had no idea when we picked this Thursday evening that we would be in the middle of a deeply upsetting and really horrifying crisis in our nation's capital, that we would be one day after a failed insurrection attempt where insurrectionists, people who were absolutely fixated on doing damage and interfering with our democracy, overran the nation's capital at the incitement of the person who is supposed to be the primary protector of our constitutional system, that is the current occupant of the White House, Donald Trump, and his enablers. An unbelievable, or frankly, all too believable situation for those of us who have been watching with increasing dread of the events of the last 4 years and hearing the just untrammeled and uncontrolled misinformation that was being spread by Trump and his enablers in Congress and elsewhere, just confusing millions of Americans, undercutting their faith in our democratic system, in our elections, and in our institutions. And so it was all too predictable that this would have devolved down into violence. What was not predictable is that the systems, the security systems, which are supposed to protect our capital, protect our representatives, would fail so spectacularly. So we at Common Cause have, of course, been focused on what is happening and what needs to happen to have an appropriate response to protect our democracy and the republic, and to ensure that those who contributed to this violence, to this lawlessness, would be held accountable. And that needs to happen at several different levels. The first, and perhaps most important, is that the occupant of the White House, Donald Trump, has to be held accountable, but not just accountable, he must be removed from power. He is a current and present threat and danger every minute that he is the titular head of our government. He has shown himself to be even more irresponsible than I think many people expected. He has shown himself very willing to incite violence and, frankly, to just directly incite the overthrow of our government. And there is only one appropriate response: get that man out of there. That is really what must be done. So at Common Cause, and if you are on our email list, you got the email this morning. We have put out a call very early on in the day. Last night we started, and early today, calling for the immediate removal of the current president of the United States by all lawful means. And what that means is that we believe that he should be removed through the application of the 25th Amendment, which allows the vice president and the cabinet to remove a president who is no longer capable of fulfilling the responsibilities of the office. Now, we can debate whether he was capable and whether he did or did not fulfill the responsibilities of the office before the election, but certainly subsequently and clearly this week, he is incapable of performing his duties. He should be removed. And that is the fastest, quickest, clearest way to remove him from the ability to create further problems. It's absolutely unclear whether the vice president and the cabinet are willing to do it. They have the capability. They are the entities who are charged with that, responsibility under the 25th Amendment. And they need to be hearing from all of us that it is their responsibility and obligation to the hundreds of millions of Americans who depend on the federal government that Donald Trump must be removed. Barring that, and perhaps in addition to that, we are calling for the impeachment of the current president. And that must be done not just because he needs to be removed from power, as I've said previously, as fast as we possibly can to protect all of our safety, but so that he can never run for federal office again. Because one of the consequences of being impeached successfully, being impeached and removed, is you are then barred from running for federal office. And we know that he, has said that he plans to run in 2024. He has raised a ridiculous amount of money as a campaign fund towards that eventuality. And given the irresponsibility, the violence, and the complete lawlessness of his current conduct, there is absolutely no way in which there should be any future in which this man has any possibility of running for federal office. Now, I've heard people say, well, he's damaged the brand. By the time all of this is over, he won't be able to run. By 2024, perhaps he will be imprisoned by New York authorities, other ways in which he's held responsible. I personally don't want to take that chance. I think that we absolutely need to be sure that he cannot in any circumstances ever run for federal office again. And we need to send a very clear message to his enablers that there are very real and severe consequences to abusing the rule of law, abusing the powers of your office. And so we have sent around a petition, and we're going to put a link to that petition in the chat. If you didn't have the email or didn't have a chance to look at the email that came around earlier today, because we really need to have a very strong showing to present to Congress and to the Vice President, and also to know who of our activists and members are concerned about this issue so that we can come back to you with further actions and ways in which we can be effective in holding the wrongdoers accountable and protecting and strengthening our democracy. And it's strengthening our democracy that we're going to be talking about in the second half of this discussion. Look out for an email tomorrow. You should be getting another email from us, not just from National, but from Common Cause New York tomorrow morning. There are 4 members of the New York congressional delegation who have engaged in sedition, who are they're 4 out of the 138 seditious members of Congress who voted not to certify results from Pennsylvania. There were 120 seditious members who voted to object to the Arizona certification of the presidential election from Arizona, there were even more of them who in the dead of night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, voted to reject the certification from the state of Pennsylvania. And if you've been following this at all, you know that there is absolutely no factual or legal basis for these objections. They have been rejected, backhanded, thrown out over and over and over again by both federal and state courts. Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the election has been rejected in 60 lawsuits, which tells you that something is very, very wrong, that they keep going back with no evidence, with absolutely no legal basis, and filing more and more specious lawsuits. So removing enablers is, we believe, extremely important. The US Constitution gives our Congress, each house of the Congress, the ability to decide for itself who is an acceptable member. In the Civil War, and the lead up to the Civil War in 1860, I believe, don't hold me to the date, but I think that was it, there were several members of Congress who were rejected because they were treasonous. They were followers of the Confederacy. We are at that stage now. It feels like it could be the beginning of a civil war, and I don't think any one of us want to see that actually happen. Therefore, there has to be consequences. The body must be able to protect itself. It must be able to determine who has violated basic ethical standards and their oath of office, which is to uphold the Constitution and not to introduce fantasies and illegal activities into the proceedings of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So tomorrow morning, we are going to be sending around an email with a way for you to sign up. And we are going to be asking our members to get in touch with your member of Congress and urge them to support immediate impeachment and the expulsion of the 4 seditious members of Congress from New York. And they are Representative Collins, Representative Stefanik, Representative Malliotakis, and Representative Zeldin. And for sure, I think we're going to hear from at least some representatives that would be an extreme measure, that they know these people, that they act in good faith. I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. They work for us, and they have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. And they need to do that by rejecting the actions of those who are willing to engage in treason and encourage and foster further treason and violence. So impeachment and removal of the seditious 4, I'm going to name them again: Zeldin, Malliotakis, Zeldin from Long Island, Malliotakis from Staten Island, Stefanik from the North Country, and Collins from Western New York. Republicans all who are willing to see our system of government destroyed. It is a sad, sad day. It's upsetting and difficult to have to ask for these kinds of actions, but frankly, I personally believe it's essential. And so we have the petition that we've linked to in the chat. Please sign up, please share it with friends, be ready to take other actions, and look out for the email tomorrow. We are going to be mobilizing further activities if you are around congressional offices in the next several days. We definitely want the seditious 4 to know that New Yorkers do not accept their conduct and want to hold them accountable. And we want every other member of the New York congressional delegation to understand how serious we are about protecting our democracy, holding them to their oath of office, and demanding accountability for this sad and frankly embarrassing and dispiriting episode in our country's history. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. And I promise you, you will be hearing more from us with more information and with more activities and actions that you can be involved in to right this wrong and to protect our democracy. So thank you for hearing me out. Thanks for being with us. And I want to turn now to the original topic for which we originally called this town hall, because the New York legislature is now back in session and coming off an extraordinary set of elections in 2020, where all of your activism made an extraordinary difference, where we saw an incredible expansion of our ability to vote absentee, where we saw close to, actually, it was a third of the voters who took advantage of early voting that we worked so very hard and relentlessly to bring to New York. All of that hard work paid off. But what we saw with the huge turnout, with the massive changes that were made, is that there's still more work to be done. And as we're seeing this week, really, it's not an exaggeration when we say that elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. At the end of the day, although we've had a prior impeachment, it's the results of the election that is going to force Donald Trump out of office, either immediately with the impeachment or certainly no later than January 20th. And that's what elections do. So we need to protect our elections. We need to make them work more smoothly, more efficiently, and we need to be sure that people have confidence in how the elections are run and that their votes are being securely and accurately counted. So we've been working with our partners at Let New York Vote to identify areas where we know we can improve the voting experience for New Yorkers, and we can make our election processes more efficient and more secure and effective. So I'm really excited and very grateful that we've been joined by some really outstanding advocates for voting rights. Today, we've got Amanda Blair from our colleagues at the Brooklyn Voters Alliance. We have Kevin Mays from HALT Solitary, who's going to talk about one of our very highest priority bills. And we're joined by Dustin Czarny, who is the Democratic Commissioner for Onondaga, Commissioner of Elections for Onondaga County, and really a stalwart commissioner working to improve our elections and in service of the voters. So I'm going to ask Amanda to take us through a brief discussion of what the priority items are that we are looking to achieve for election reform in the 2021 session. What are BVA's priorities? What are Let New York Vote priorities? Amanda, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for being here. I got into the nitty-gritty of New York politics regarding voting when I moved to the city in 2016. So I coincided with a very important moment in history. And so we dived right in to try to change our laws, our voting laws here in New York. And we've had a lot of success in the last 2 years. And so we want to keep that going because as we saw in this past election in November in New York, things are not perfect. There's always room for improvement. And that's what we want to do. And we want to have a lot of the legislation that might have been done by executive order. We want to have that on the books. We want to refine some of our laws. And we also want to take steps to change possibly the way we do elections here in New York. We're one of the last states to count our votes. There's certain good reasons why that happens and certain bad ones. But I'm going to take you through the coalition had a meeting, the Let New York Vote Coalition had a meeting in December and voted on their top 5 priorities for the 2021 legislative session. And then I'm going to add, and BVA, we're a small group based in Brooklyn, a group of volunteers who just were like, we need to change the way New York voting works. We often adopt the slate for Let New York Vote. And then we have our own priorities that we have separately that we also push with our representatives. And so the top two priorities are pushing through the second vote for the constitutional amendments. That's no excuse, absentee voting, and same day registration. So same day registration is pretty straightforward. I have done voter protection where someone wants to vote, they decide on the day of, they're interested. Instead of letting them vote, they're turned away. It is a devastating thing to see. There's really no reason for it. So same day registration would change our constitution because right now we have, you need to be registered 25 days before the election. It could be up to 10 days, but we haven't changed that law. So it would just remove that stopgap process. When someone goes to their right poll site, they can get registered and then they can vote. Once it is passed for a second time, it was passed we now have 2 legislative sessions. I'm not going to bore you with that, but it was passed previously. It's going to be passed again in this session. And then we, the voters, will vote on it in the next election. So we should be voting on it this fall. The second constitutional amendment is no excuse absentee voting. Essentially, we kind of had that for this election, the November election and the primaries, because first Governor Cuomo expanded the definition of illness to account for the pandemic that we're currently in. And then that was codified this summer by our legislature. So, you could use COVID as an excuse. And I'm sure if any of you voted by mail, you saw that option or you were notified by it through friends, family, media, advocacy groups to check that box, and then you could vote by mail. That's great. It's fantastic. It led to a lot of people participating in this new way that's completely new to New York. Early voting, is very new. It's only about like a year old. And so that was a really great thing to see, but we want that codified. We want in our Constitution that people don't have to choose an excuse. If they want to vote by mail, they have that option. So we want that passed. Again, we, the voters, will have to vote on it to make it law. The next priority is Board of Elections reform. So I'm sure you heard a lot about that. Our mayor the mayor in New York City came out and talked about it. The governor mentioned it, because if you saw those hour-long lines, several hours, I waited in line for like 3 hours. And I was of course going to do it, but I was even surprised that I needed to wait in line for 3 hours. My grandmother, my 75-year-old grandmother, waited in line for 6 hours. It's disgraceful. We don't want that happening. It shouldn't happen. It happens time and time again in neighborhoods in Brooklyn that I've seen since I've been here. It needs to be addressed. And so that's a structural issue. There are some issues with the administration of the Board of Elections. You're going to see a lot of debate coming up about how can we fix the way that we actually conduct our elections. Should we have a Board of Elections? So watch out for those reforms. There's structural reforms, and then transparency issues. How do they make decisions? How do they choose poll sites? What information are they giving to the public? How do you decide that you're gonna, changes that we saw in real time? Okay, the elderly can skip lines. Who's disseminating that information? Who made that decision? Those are things we want to know as voters so that we can have a smoother process when we're voting. The next huge reform is the Voting Rights Act, which was renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York. If you don't know, you should know, in the Supreme Court in 2013 gutted our Federal Voting Rights Act, stripping away preclearance, which means we're playing tag in the courts. So someone changes a law that will suppress voters, for example, enacting voter ID law the day after the Supreme Court issues a decision gutting the Voting Rights Act. That voter ID law disenfranchises voters The remedy is to sue in court, but first you have to have a cause of action, which means someone has to be disenfranchised, which means they didn't get to vote in that election. And then the court will say, oh, maybe that's not good, you know, maybe we'll remedy that. You know, you're playing tag, you're playing catch up. That's not the way the process should be. Preclearance, we will have a form of preclearance in New York, finding target areas that have issues with voter suppression. And, you know, any changes they want to make to the administration of their law will have to go through a process there. It'll also codify certain reforms with regards to language access. It will figure out how to break deadlocks in the Board of Elections. It's a comprehensive law that I suggest you look at. It's going to be, if it's hopefully passed, it would be fantastic. And then the final reform for Let New York Vote for this session doesn't mean it's the only reform. These are just the high priority reforms for this session. Absentee ballot reforms. So we have a lot of issues around our absentee ballots. If you're in New York City, they tried to do a tracker. My family's ballots who voted by absentee never were marked as received. So I have no idea. They haven't gotten a letter saying they weren't counted, but we are far, far behind, which is reasonable. I mean, we only just started broadening absentee voting to essentially everyone in New York this past election, well, the primaries, but we need to play catch up with absentee voting. So the reforms that people are looking for to have uniform standards with regards to absentee ballot drop boxes at the poll sites. You know, Governor Cuomo came out with the executive order saying everyone needs to do that, but that wasn't uniform across the state. Return postage. So if you notice in the primaries, there was return postage. There wasn't in the general election. That's an added cost for voters. And also, it's just unfair. If you're voting in person, you are not paying to vote. But if you decide to vote by mail, even if it's a 35-cent or 45-cent stamp for 55 cents, I don't really know what it is now. I just buy the forever ones. You know, you're paying to vote. That's a problem fundamentally. Fix issues with challenges and, you know, make sure with regards to how we're tabulating our absentee voting, allow some of that processing work to start sooner. Right now, by law, we start a lot of that processing after the vote because as you might know, New York is unique where you can vote absentee and then go vote in at the poll. And so to keep that, we have to, you know, separate. We have to make sure you didn't go then vote at the poll. But there are some kinds of processing steps that we can do beforehand to help with our count later, so it's not as slow as it's currently been. So those are the 5 reforms. I'll go through them again. It's no excuse in same-day voter registration. We want those passed again. They're constitutional amendments. Board of Elections reform, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, and strengthening absentee balloting. In addition, the Brooklyn Voters Alliance, which we're a tiny group, but we have big mouths and loud voices. We try to make an impact. We also, one of our top priorities is ending felony disenfranchisement. We did a panel on this last year. You know, we should see action in the New York, our Congress in New York, ending disenfranchisement for people on parole, but we want it ended in totality. If you look at the history of New York, felony disenfranchisement is linked to suppressing the vote of Black males. And so it's racist at its founding, and it's not a policy that has any basis in our society right now. And so that's a reform that's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot to change the mindsets of people, but we're working in that direction. And I think, you know, we'll get there one day. Yeah.
Amanda, thank you for that succinct overview of our priorities. And I do want to say that if you have a question, either about what's going on in Washington or what we are working on in terms of elections, some people have been posting questions. And I meant to ask you to mark at the beginning of your question, I was going to say a Q, but right now we're not doing any Q stuff. I'm going to say, if you want to put a capital A at the beginning of your question, and then when we scroll through, we'll know it's a question and we'll be able to pick it up more quickly. Because after our speakers, we will get to questions. And I'm extremely happy that we have been joined by Kevin Mays, who is going to pick up, I think, from the last topic that Amanda brought us to, and that is the need to ensure that returning citizens have their full rights restored. Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to preface my thoughts by saying, Amanda, thank you very much for what you just took and conveyed as it applies to felony disenfranchisement of people who are formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated. And let me also take this time out to take and thank Susan Lerner and Victor Pate for allowing me to take and be a part of the Common Course platform this evening to discuss the codification of voting rights for people who are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. First and foremost, I'm a representative of the HALT Solitary Campaign. And, you know, that campaign, against alternatives to isolated confinement is a very huge campaign here in New York that is basically trying to take and annihilate and destroy and get rid of solitary confinement in this state as well as in other states, because of its unconstitutional practices and all the other different human rights issues that accompany it. But with regard to voting rights and the codification of the law, currently I'm under parole supervision. I returned back as a returning citizen as of June 10th, 2019. And since I've been back out in society, I hit the ground running because of all the work that I was doing while I was still inside, and a lot of the different alliances that I've made with legislators, post-secondary educators, and a lot of community-based organizations. The problem that I see that we have in New York State here is the fact that without us taking and pushing to have the law codified so that people who are returning citizens can actually vote, is we have to take and rely on the person who is sitting in the governor's chair. And we have to take and rely on whether or not they're going to take and provide us with an actual pardon itself. By him utilizing executive powers to do so, that's what gives us the authorization in order to vote. But let me explain a little bit about why that process is inadequate and discuss some of the deficiencies that I see. Number one, when what happens is the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, they take and they provide a list to the governor's office of individuals who are getting ready to be released back to society. Once that happens, the governor's office, he takes that list and he effectively takes and provides a pardon for each person on that list. The problem with that is that once that happens, then what happens, right? How do I find out as a returning citizen?
You're frozen.
The parole officer who is basically under their supervision with regard to certain stipulations that are made that you have to adhere to, or you will be taken back into custody while under supervision. What they do is they trickle this down, they send this information to these parole agencies, and they want them to take and distribute it to the individuals that they have under supervision that's in their case file. The problem that we have with that is that clearly to expect them to take and perform that duty is a little bit much, because they already are overworked and already complaining about that they didn't never want to be a part of that process. And I myself had to take and go through extraordinary measures just to find out that I was given this actual pardon in and of itself. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that you ask yourself, well, do they really want us to be able to? Because if they did, they haven't put anything behind them taking and providing information to individuals that are returning citizens. What happens once the governor takes and fixes his signature, whereby he takes and provides the pardon? What is it I'm supposed to take and do next in order to take and receive the actual pardon itself? How long will this effectively take place for me to actually be able to realize this new restored right and to be able to vote? Oftentimes, my experience of people that I know of, 90 days, 6 months into you actually being released back to society, people still have not realized or have not been given information with regard to the pardon actually being provided. Huge problem with that. The other thing is, we talk about Executive Order 181, because that is the provision or the executive order whereby the governor takes in, whereby the governor takes and fixes his signature, so he takes and provides pardons to those that are actually released, and that takes and annihilates and provides individuals so that they're no longer disenfranchised, right? When that order was taken into place, when you take and you read the syntax of the order in and of itself, there are a bunch of different things in there that you call into question. So clearly, since I've been back out here in society, myself, Victor Pate, community and college fellowship, we have took the initiative to get a bunch of individuals that were formerly incarcerated registered to vote, and have taken the initiative to go into Rikers Island and several other places so that individuals who have not been adjudicated as offenders yet, so that they can take and realize the opportunity to take and vote in the primary election that's here in the city, as opposed to, the national election hadn't occurred yet. So we have done a great deal with regard to that, talking to the legislators, both on the Senate side and in the Assembly, about the importance of this bill and the fact that that's the only real thing that they recognize. Clearly, in New York, legislators as of recent, they took and they passed bail reform, and then they took and they did something with discovery, right? 90 days later, they took and initiate a campaign that was based upon a false narrative in order to scare people and have people all heightened concerned about them. And then they took and they went back and they repealed those same so-called progressive decisions that they made in order to take and do that. So clearly we feel that it's important that we register as many people as we can who are formerly incarcerated to be able to take and vote, and to create a voting block so that when we go talk to these elected officials, we let them know that if you do not support this bill, that when it comes time for you to be reelected and to get back in the office, we're going to stand against you. You feel that it was to be taken what it was we were saying to be important. But those are some of the different things that we are experiencing as it applies to trying to get the codification and able to vote passed by the legislation. And we think that it's a worthy task. We feel that we have to take, and we have an obligation.
So, Kevin, I think we may have lost his. I'm
back.
You're back. Well,
I'm back.
Okay. Well, that I think has given us a really clear path in terms of what we need to be supporting. And I want to let people know that the bill number for the codification of voting rights for recently released individuals is S830. And you're going to be hearing more about that, and we're going to be asking you to take supportive action in terms of getting in touch with your state senators and with your assembly members. There are going to be call-in days. There are going to be other activities that are coming up. And we're really grateful for the leadership of our colleagues in HALT Solitary and Vocal New York for really showing the way to move this really important issue through the legislature.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Kevin. And last, before we go to questions, I am very grateful that Dustin Czarny has found time in his amazingly busy schedule to join us and to share with us what is actually going to happen with election reform in the legislature next week. Because I'm happy to say that following a pattern that they started at our urging in 2019, they are starting the session with the democracy package with some election reform. So Dustin, going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for having me. Common Cause and Let New York Vote is, I'm not officially part of the coalition because I am an elections commissioner, but I feel like you're my spiritual animals. So, and kindred spirits, and I do share many, if not all, of the goals of Let New York Vote, and especially the spirit of making our Byzantine and antique election laws better for the modern, New York voter. And we have seen incredible changes over the last few years. Despite a pandemic, despite a budget shortfalls, we have added early voting. We have added a robust vote by mail system. And there are many things that we need to continue to improve. And I am very excited to talk about the bills that are going to be put in place by the New York State Senate Democratic Caucus on Monday and Tuesday, and hopefully shortly thereafter by the Assembly. These bills are going to be put up because I think it's going to solve a lot of the goals that the Let New York Vote and Common Cause Coalition have, and also the Democratic Caucus of Elections Commissioners as well. I think what we're seeing is a theme that they're putting together next week is a way to fix the absentee ballot issues that we have in New York. New York was designed as an in-person voting state. All of our election laws really take that into consideration and compel people to come in person as opposed to voting by mail. But with this novel coronavirus pandemic that's going to continue at least for the next year, the vote by mail option, we have to find a way to resolve a lot of these issues, both on an administrative level for elections commissioners and also for the voters as well. And I think the bills that are being put forward next week by the New York State Senate Democrats and shortly thereafter by the Assembly, I think will go a long way in addressing those. So the 8 bills, and I'll briefly mention the bill numbers, but I'm sure Common Cause and Let New York will put those out there as part of a press release, over the next week to get people to support them. The 8 bills that will be introduced on Monday is the first one, S253, deals with prohibiting the voiding of absentee ballots for stray marks or where the intention of the voter is clear. It prohibits boards of elections from throwing those ballots out or them being objected to as well. So that's very important. Bill, we saw that during the objection process this last year, many ridiculous objections were leveled against really valid ballots, and it slowed down the process quite a bit. So this bill would eliminate that objection, for stray marks or food stains or whatever may come. S264 will change the deadline for requesting absentee ballots to 15 days before the election. And while that can be seen as a restriction of rights on voting, what it does is it really puts into law the practice that is in place at boards of elections. If you're mailing in an application for an absentee ballot, really we need that mail to hit at the 15th day before the election for it to be able to get to a board of elections, be received, processed, and mailed out in time for you to return that ballot back. So it's taking into account the modern mail system and making sure that there's a realistic deadline for voters to request an absentee ballot and have the Board of Elections mail that back out to them. S492 authorizes drop boxes permanently. This was done by executive order by the governor last year, and now this bill will make it a permanent function of boards of elections to have drop boxes for absentee ballots, either at polling places or early voting centers. These were incredibly useful to have people be able to drop off those absentee ballots without having to rely on the U.S. mail to get that to the boards of elections. And having a legislative action on this will prevent any nefarious actors from objecting to those ballots, as we saw during this last absentee voting period. S516 is a rolling time frame for delivery of the ballot. So the Board of Elections will have a time frame for when we have to actually mail out a ballot in relation to when we receive an application. Now, right now, there is no standard in law for when a Board of Elections will have to mail a ballot out, although most boards do try to get it out as quickly as possible. This will mandate it, and it'll make sure that keep boards from waiting to the last possible moment to mail out a ballot to the voter once an absentee application comes in. Usually within 2 to 3 days, we'll be mandated to mail it out. S631 will increase the time for when you can apply for an absentee ballot. Right now, it's 30 days in law. 30 days before an election is when you legally can start to apply for an absentee ballot. This will make it 60 days. So this will keep boards of elections. It'll start mandating boards of elections to be able to start mailing out ballots earlier than the 30-day mark, and also it will spread out those applications over a longer period of time, easing the burden on the board at the last minute. S632 makes permanent the email and portal system for applying for absentee ballots. One of the major advantages that voters had this last time around that I think led to the ubiquitous use of mail-in voting across the state is the portal system designed by the State Board of Elections, that people could go online and fill out an HTML document and have it automatically sent to their local county board and as an application for an absentee ballot. This was a huge saver, not only for the voters, but for the boards of elections as well, because it was much easier to process these applications as they came in, as opposed to paper applications that needed to be scanned and double checked. This portal system that the state board did as part of an executive order will be made permanent with this bill. And then S1027, probably the most transformative bill in this bunch. This will start the counting of absentee ballots before Election Day, allowing for the canvassing ballots on the time between early voting and Election Day, and having at least partial results released on election night. This will do many different things. Most importantly, it'll allow us an assurity of who won the elections in a reasonable time frame. But also it will it will protect these absentee ballots from these ridiculous legal challenges that we saw after the election this last time. If if the outcome of an election is not yet known, there's less reason for objections to come in. This bill not only allows for the canvassing of ballots before Election Day, but it'll streamline the objection process. It'll streamline the court process after Election Day, and it also still allows for an ability for people to be able to cast a vote on Election Day if they applied for an absentee ballot, by either returning that absentee ballot on Election Day or voting by affidavit if they have not returned their affidavit ballot. So there still will be an option for people to go to the polls and vote on Election Day. And so that option will still be maintained. But early voting, you'll be able to vote just like normal, and then we would pull your absentee ballot after we received your early voting, because we can't start opening them until after the polls close on the Sunday of early voting. And then the final bill that is going to be passed on Monday, S1028, this creates an absentee ballot tracking system statewide through the State Board of Elections. This is something that New York City had through their New York City Board of Elections, and several different counties had. We had one in Onondaga County, but not every county had. And this would be a more streamlined system and more, ubiquitous use of a tracking system, so we could cut down on people calling to see if we received their application, if we mailed out their absentee ballot. It'll show not only that we received it back, but that we counted it, and if we didn't count it, why. So this is a bill that would create a statewide system to put that in place. And then on Tuesday, they're calling it Constitution Day at the New York State Senate. They're going to be doing several different constitutional amendments, and two big ones with voting. The S-360 is the second passage of the no excuse absentee constitutional amendment, where it removes the excuse requirement by the New York State Constitution for absentees. This will allow for, in 2022 and beyond, a universal vote by mail system, or at least a universal ability to vote by mail system. You'll no longer need an excuse to apply, and it could actually eventually lead to mailing out ballots like we saw in California and other places as well. Probably not right away. We need several years to work on our registration system, but this is important to get to that point. And then the final thing is S-517. This will be the second passage of the same day registration bill, which is basically removing the 10-day requirement of 10 days before election day to be registered to vote in New York. This will allow for same day registration in New York, as we see in 21 other states. How that will work is still yet to be defined. But by changing this constitutional amendment, it will allow for enabling legislation to put that in place. So these bills are fundamental, to continuing the tradition of this new unified democratic New York State government in expanding the right to vote. Senator Myrie likes to say we're trying to go from worst to first in New York. And this will put us well on the way. It'll solve a lot of the issues that we saw with absentee balloting last year. It will resolve a lot of issues and put a lot of burden and responsibility on the boards of elections. But that's what we're here for, and we're here to make that happen. So these are the bills that are first up, but they have promised that they're not the only bills that will be passed this session, and many other bills they are working on, and hopefully will continue to work towards in session, such as felon reenfranchisement, such as the John Lewis New York Voting Rights Act, something that I'm a big advocate for as well. So that's what's going on next week.
Yeah, it's going to be a big week early on, starting with democracy. And thank goodness that it's happening at the state level, because we do have this fight on our hands at the federal level. So this is your opportunity for questions. If anybody has questions for Kevin or for Dustin or for Amanda, please put them in the chat. We do have a bunch of questions which people have posted. One question is, does the absentee ballot reform include accessible absentee ballots?
That's a good question. I believe the accessible absentee ballots was done as a court settlement, and we will continue to do that in the future. I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that. So I'm going to have to find out, but I believe so. I believe we had to choose vendors last year to do these absentee ballots. I believe the spirit of that is that we're going to continue to do that in the future as directed by the state board because of this court settlement. Whether that's going to be part of legislation or not, I don't know.
Okay. Some more voting questions. How will automatic voter registration work? Like the selective service or what?
Again, we won't know for a little while. So the automatic voter registration, as enacted in other states, simply moves from an opt-in system to an opt-out system. So like at the Department of Motor Vehicles, this is actually a pretty easy thing to do, that if you're a citizen and you interact with the Department of Motor Vehicles getting a license or a non-driver ID, instead of giving the option to register to vote, being registered to vote will be part of the application system. And you'll have to opt out if you don't want to do that. This is important because it'll update not just new registered voters. And now that we have pre-registration at 16 and 17, this can be doubly important because that's when people interact with the Department of Motor Vehicles when they're getting their driver's license at 16 and 17. It will also update people when they change addresses. And so our voter rolls will be more accurate and more efficient. We will get those changes instead of getting a mad rush of voter registration changes right before a deadline. The question is how's it going to interact with the social agencies who don't normally already transmit data to the Board of Elections in an electronic form? And that's why the implementation of this isn't going to go until 2023. It's paired with online voter registration. So hopefully boards of elections will be able to do online voter registration, not just the DMV doing it online. And there will be a statewide system that is mandated to be serviced by the state board, and then all that information is sent to the county boards. So we're going to have to watch as this is being developed and as the vendors are developing it, exactly how it's going to work.
So Dustin, there's a specific question for you. Do you know how many people vote in person after voting absentee?
It is not, well, normally it's incredibly small. So normally we're talking about a very small percentage that actually vote in person after voting absentee. We did see a lot higher percentage of that this time around than we've seen before. Not just because we had more mail-in balloting, but the rhetoric behind mail-in voting from the national campaign of Donald Trump, and we all know who was doing it, led a lot of people to believe that there was going to be lawsuits that would invalidate absentee balloting or mail-in balloting. Also, once people realized that the absentee ballots and mail-in ballots were counted after Election Day in New York, you saw more people, if they could, go to the polls on Election Day or during early voting. So, but it's still a very small percent. We're talking about, 0.01, it's really, really small. I think I had out of 59,000 absentee ballots in Onondaga County, of people who actually voted on Election Day or during early voting, around 300 of them were that. A significant amount, but not statistically significant amount. So, and I do believe that those numbers were amplified because of the rhetoric and newness. Whereas if these votes were counted and part of the election night totals, I think that number would drop dramatically.
So a question for you, Amanda. I'm wondering whether there are any future plans to extend the one-day polling, not just mail-in, to 5 days here in New York on a permanent basis. Thanks.
Yes, I still don't understand that question though. Susan, do you know what might be being asked there?
So, I think, Johanna, we now have early voting. So you can vote in person for a 10-day period before the final election day.
Except for the day right before the election.
Right, there's a break.
Yeah, and so one of the items the coalition discussed were, where it was early voting and expansion of early voting. There's always discussions about expansion of hours, more poll sites. But since we did have, even with the long lines, have a pretty successful first national election with early voting, it kind of drops down on our list. But we can always make more reforms when it comes to early voting, because we're seeing, as we have issues with mail-in voting and trust in the postal and the post office, unfortunately, a lot of voters are using the option of voting early in person. So Brooklyn Voters Alliance, when we had the national election, we were directing voters to vote early in person so that we could reduce the amount of people voting on the polls on election day. But then, if they just felt more secure actually going to the poll site, they can do so. But hopefully we've been able to answer your question, Johanna.
Yeah, and Joanna, yes, it is permanent.
Yes, it's not just because of COVID. We actually, our first election was last year, but that was, a low turnout election.
So Kevin, a question. I'm sorry.
If I could just say something to that, we need to expand early voting. It is something that we need to expand in terms of number of sites and the minimum number of sites in each county. That's something that I believe thoroughly is going to continue to grow despite, even when COVID is gone, and we've seen that in other states, where it starts off slow and then builds and builds and builds and becomes about 1/3 of your electorate. Right now, it's about 1/4 of our electorate. It's going to continue to grow, and it's a great option, and we need to invest in that.
So, Kevin, a question for you.
Yes.
What if S830 passes?
Yes.
Will the returning citizens be automatically registered, or do you still have to fill out a form?
You still have to fill out a form. If the bill actually passed, you still have to fill out a form. You're not going. It would change the paradigm. They would no longer have to record, and then you would be, I guess, you would be responsible for taking and initiating that process yourself.
Got it.
Yes.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. If I can add, because when I was registering voters this summer, we ran into this, this issue sometimes when voters who were previously incarcerated and they didn't know if they could vote. Well, one, a lot of times it was, I have a felony, I can't vote. We have to stop that now, because we have the executive order in place. People can vote if they are on probation, or if they've completely completed their anything associated with their sentence. So we have to stop the first response being, I can't vote, I have a felony. That's not accurate. We want to reduce that mindset. Second, it's a pretty onerous process, because when people are trying to figure out if they've been pardoned, you have to have the right link. So you need a smartphone. When you're in the field, they have to know their inmate number. And I guess maybe a lot of people know that, but if it's been a while, they might not know it. And you don't want to give people the wrong information, because if you improperly register them, that creates problems for them with regards to whatever obligations they have with the state government. As Kevin and his group is advocating, as we're advocating, as we hope gets passed next week, and if not next week, very soon, to take away a lot of that burden, and then to change the messaging so that people understand that a felony is no longer a bar in New York.
And if I could say, I would be for that as an election administrator, because it is a added burden on us to track the pardon system instead of just registering people to vote. And if they're out on parole, or they should be, they're not actually incarcerated, it's very easy to check whether they're actually incarcerated or not, and then allow them to
or they aren't.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But there was a high incidence of misinformation and mischaracterizations as it applied to that. So she's definitively right, as well as Dustin as well. And that's the reason why we had forums. We continue to have forums in order to take and educate, folks with regard to those instances.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all of us, as Amanda pointed out, when we're doing voter registration, really, we need to have this clarity, right? Your body is directly in front of us. If you're on the street, you get to. That's it. Let's make it simple. There are further questions, but we are past 8:30. We called this for an hour. Where if people want us to stay with us and have us answer a few more questions, certainly willing to do so. Feel free to leave us if your time is past. But I do want to get to some of the other questions. So for instance, we've got a question: isn't there a better chance, given the time frame, for an Article 25 removal, such as Pelosi and Schumer are calling for? Well, that is definitely going to be the quickest way to remove the occupant of the White House from any position of authority. And definitely we want to see them do that. But it does not prevent Trump from running for federal office again. And we think it may be necessary to go through both. So we want to see quick action, but we also want to see Congress function and satisfy its constitutional obligations. We had another question If the House impeached the president, how likely is it that the Senate would remove the president? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think that we're in a very different situation where I think there is a possibility that Republican senators, seeing what has happened, not just Mitt Romney, would vote for impeachment. So I don't think this is a futile exercise at all. And then the final question we received on that is, how do we prevent his sons from running for office? And I think you're going to have to talk to the Manhattan DA and the New York AG about that possibility. Let's see. Dustin answered that in the chat, which is great. Let's see. Do the absentee reforms include allowing ballots to be tallied even if the voter passes away after mailing in a ballot? It's an issue in the New York 22 legal proceedings. And Dustin, before you answer that, you're going to have to say a little bit about the New York 22 proceedings.
Yeah, I mean, thank God I'm not a part of it. That's the first thing I'm going to say. So election law says that you have to be alive to cast a ballot. Because we tally absentee ballots after Election Day, if someone is known to have passed away, either through an obituary or a health record or something like that, then those ballots are no longer counted. What the absentee ballot reforms do is allow us to start counting those absentee ballots on the Monday and Sunday night and Monday before Election Day, and of course on Election Day as well. If somebody passes away during that time period, then those ballots are going to get counted because they're going to be tallied during that time period. There is a discrepancy there, right? So if you go and early vote and put that vote in the machine and walk out of the early voting center and gets hit by a bus, unfortunately, that vote counts. There's no way for us to take that vote out of the machine. Whereas in an absentee ballot, if you put it in the mail, but yet passed away before we tally it and we know about it, then that ballot won't count. So there is a discrepancy there. But of course, there is also a fraud protection there as well, because when you vote in person, we know who you are and you're putting it in the machine, whereas an absentee ballot, the signature verification is the only thing, and we don't know when you signed that ballot and when it was actually placed into the mail. So, I'm not sure there's going to ever be a perfect system on that. I guess I would prefer, to start counting the ballots earlier to prevent the hyper scrutinization of absentee ballots, which will resolve some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I swear I did not plant this question, but I think it'll be the final question of the evening. And that is, where is Common Cause on ranked voting and also the assignment of presidential electors based on the national popular vote? Well, thank you for setting that up for me. Common Cause is a very strong endorser of ranked choice voting. We are the people who helped put ranked choice voting on the ballot in New York City and pass it. And we are engaged in a really extensive education campaign in New York City to be sure that New York City voters are aware that they now can rank their choices for the city primary and special elections. So we're big fans and proponents of ranked choice voting. And we also are very strong supporters of what's called National Popular Vote, which is an interstate compact which requires that when states sufficient to total more than 370 or 270 electoral college votes all agree they will all cast their electoral college votes for the winner of the popular election nationwide, not necessarily the winner for their state. And that is a way to really deal with the problem of the Electoral College without a constitutional amendment. And I've been asked, where is Common Cause on hand-marked paper ballots versus touchscreen voting machines? Where we always have been, which is with hand-marked paper ballots. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much to our guests who have provided us with such really interesting and important information.
Thank you, Susan.
And watch out for tomorrow's email where we need to hold these 4 seditious members of Congress accountable. And good luck to all of us. We are going to stay with our democracy and strengthen it in every way we know how at every level of government. Thanks for being with us. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.